And a good day to you, Explorer Nation. John Lynskey, your ambassador of alumni affairs, here with season 5, episode 11, lucky number 11, Looking Back with Lynskey. And this is personally a very special one for me. Our guest today is quite simply the best linebacker to play in the long history of Columbus football, and that says a lot because we've had some great linebackers. He is who I wanted to be when I was a sophomore in high school. Went on to have a tremendous career, University of Notre Dame, 4 years with the New York Giants, 2 years with the Memphis Showboats of the USFL, firefighter, small business owner, and the example of what an explorer should be. So it is my honor to welcome from the great class of 1976, Mr. Mike Whittington. Mike, welcome to the program, buddy.
Thank you very much, John. It's a real honor to be included in this, and I'm really looking forward to having this chat. And like you said, I've had a wonderful life. I've done things that I couldn't have dreamed of as a kid, that I would have been able to do some of the things that I've done. And Columbus opened that pathway for me. It really did. It made a big difference in my life. So I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes. In fact, here we go. Mike, we all had a different path getting to Columbus High School. I mean, I knew where I was going to go. I came from Epiphany, went right to Columbus like everybody did. You had a slightly different path because your older brother was a tremendous athlete at Gables, and that seemed to be, where you were going to go. And so tell us how you ended up at 3000 Southwest 87th Avenue.
Well, it wasn't just my one brother. I had 4 siblings, older siblings, that all went to Gables, all graduates from the mid-60s to 71. 3 brothers and a sister. And 2 of my brothers played football there, and they were on these phenomenal high school football teams, mythical national championship teams that just destroyed local competition. And I grew up with that. They were older than me, 9, 8, 7 years older. So as a kid, I just watched the Coral Gables Cavaliers just run over all their opponents. And just that was going to be my dream, to play for Nick Cody's at Gables and be one of the 100 that ran out on the field. And it was just ingrained in me. It was ingrained in the family, and it didn't happen that way. And I'm really happy it didn't. I think one of the reasons why Nick Cody's retired and took a little of the mystique away from Gables, although they were still a really strong team. And, Columbus had only beaten them one time in the history of the school.
Correct.
But I as a kid growing up, that garnet, that red and gray uniform and black shoes is just, that's what I saw. And I had 2 brothers that were really phenomenal football players, very good students, and they had a lot of success at Gables. And for me not to go there, it didn't sit real well with them, but it was just a choice that I made that I think that I wanted to accomplish. So, we can go back. I grew up by Epiphany Church. That's where we were. Family of 6, took up a pew right next to the Cliffords. Clifford family of Gables fame had a pew. We had a pew, and none of us kids, the Whittingtons, went to Epiphany Elementary. We went to West Lab, Ponce, Gables.
Okay.
That was our route. And I started at West Lab, and after 5th grade, I actually transferred to Sunset Elementary for 6th grade. And after 6th grade, the neighborhood kids were talking about, remember, this was late 60s, early 70s, and a lot of things were going on. A lot of kids were starting to go to private schools, and some of the kids in my neighborhood were talking about going to Florida Christian. So I went home one day and asked my dad, hey, instead of going to Palms, can I go to Florida Christian with my buddies? And he was okay with it. And so I spent 7th and 8th grade at Florida Christian. And I mean, athletically, it was phenomenal because I got to play tackle football, baseball, basketball, and we traveled to the Keys and all over Miami-Dade playing these other Christian schools like Miami Christian, Dade Christian, Westminster, Gulliver, Coral Shores. And it was just a group of us. And we really weren't that small school material. A lot of us ended up transferring out. Like Eddie Angelo became the quarterback at Gables, was on our team. But we had a fun time, and I couldn't play tackle football in the youth Optimist leagues because I was just too big, too heavy.
Yeah, sure.
So my first experience of playing football was in 7th grade at Florida Christian. Now my brothers all played Gray Ghosts, and they were like phenomenal players in those Optimist leagues, but I couldn't make the weight. So after 8th grade, family discussion with my dad, it was just getting a little too religious. It was a fundamentally Baptist school, Florida Christian. It was just a little too religious. And so I just talked to my dad, and we decided that as a stopgap, go to Columbus for 9th grade because Gables didn't have 9th grade then.
That's right. Yeah.
So I went to Columbus for 9th grade as just a fill-in year because my intentions were to transfer and go to Gables. So that happened. I went to Columbus. I played on the JV team and had a lot of fun, made some friends, but I did not know many people there because I had gone to Sunset and Florida Christian. So the only friends I knew from at Columbus were some Epiphany guys that I got to know from the neighborhood and from CCD. And I didn't have religious education, so I went to CCD and got confirmed and all those religious events. So I got to know some of those guys like Argo Argomanis, Nacho Alvarez, Bill Gregory, Bob Zinzel, Tommy Dorsey, and Tom Saunders. But I really didn't know them that well. I just knew them by association. So I walked into Columbus really not knowing anybody really close. The only one I really knew pretty close was Kerry Nash because we played Little League baseball together. And he was not from a parochial school either. So it was a little strange walking in. I can remember taking the entrance exam, and I was waiting outside the cafeteria doors to go in, and I looked around and did not know a soul.
Wow.
Of all these kids going in to take this exam, and I'm thinking, am I in the wrong place? And I'll never forget, this gentleman walks up to me and shook my hand and welcomed me and said good luck. And it was turned out to be Dick Pollock.
What a great man.
And I had no idea who Dick Pollock was.
Yeah.
But I think Dick Pollock knew who I was.
Yeah, Dick did his homework.
Yeah. So, why is this Whittington kid not going to Gables? And he had coached against Gables. He knew Gables. He knew who the Whittingtons were.
Sure.
It would have been like a Clifford kid or an Ortega kid walking into Columbus at the time. Thinking back, and I had watched for many, many years Gables just crushing Columbus.
Yeah.
And I was in the stands and I was watching that. So I guess it was a bigger deal than I realized that I was ending up going to Columbus at the time.
When did you start to feel at home, and what made you decide to stay instead of transferring to Gables? You remember?
If not many people remember this, but so sophomore year, I got moved up to varsity.
Yeah.
And
it was very, very, very unusual back then, Mike. Very.
Yeah. So I played defensive end all year, and I was surrounded by a lot of talent that just didn't know how to win.
Mm.
And I didn't make a lot of friends on that team because they were, upperclassmen.
Sure.
And I wasn't there to make friends. I was a little bitter about being on the varsity, and we weren't winning. JV was winning all their games. But I knew I belonged there talent-wise, and I really enjoyed it. And I had a bunch of sophomores in the stands cheering me on, and I played defensive end, and I played like a crazy man. And I think I gained a lot of respect from some of the upperclassmen, but it was frustrating because those guys just weren't used to winning. They didn't know how to win, and they didn't practice and play to win. But they were a lot of talented guys. I mean, I just look back and think of some of those guys like Suarez on the offensive line, and Hafner, and Tom Blue, and Carterillo, Villock. Running backs were just phenomenal players. So after that year, I was seriously considering transferring to Gables, and not many people know this, but I did transfer to Gables during that spring. I left Columbus, and I spent a week at Gables. And I remember my exit interview with Brother Hugh.
Yeah.
And Brother Hugh said, "Listen, Mike, if it doesn't work out there, you're welcome to come back here." And, I left on good terms, and but I had this, I wanted to go play with winners. I wanted to play with a winning school, and I missed the tradition of the Gables, the mystique. And might have been a little pressure from my brothers. My dad never pressured me to do anything athletically, never. Always enjoyed me playing, but he was happy to be in my corner no matter what I wanted to do. So he backed me going back to Gables, and I spent a week in the classrooms, and I'll never forget Coach. They had a linebacker, their defensive coordinator was McCluskey, and his daughter Julie kind of took me by the hand and walked me to my classes and did her best to make me feel at home. But after a week there, I went home and I went into my dad and I said, "You know what? This is not my home. Columbus is my home." And I was back at Columbus a week later. And
I didn't know that, Mike.
Yeah. It was, I tell you, it was really big deal not going to Gables. I mean, I had a lot of friends that I went to, Sunshine Elementary and in the neighborhood. And I grew up idol. I mean, my idol, like you said you wanted to play like me. I wanted to play like Ralph Ortega.
Yeah.
And Ralph Ortega and Glenn Cameron were my idols. They were in my sister's class. They were at my house. The Ortega family was my brother's best friend. There's the Cliffords, the Ortegas, the Dunns, Gary Dunn, the Colesies, Gerald Tinker, gold medal winner. I knew all these guys. These were friends of the family.
Yeah.
These guys were at my house constantly. And for me to not go to Gables was huge. And then for me to break away. But when I came back, what I realized when I left Columbus was there was more to school than winning his tradition, football history, and there was just more. There was more there. There was something that was missing when I went to Gables, and I knew that it was a special thing about Columbus, that it's not just about athletics and academics. It's more about, it's equally about the spiritual experience and getting to know your classmates, your teachers, and your administration and coaches more than just a figurehead. And I missed that. And even at a year and a half at Columbus, I knew it was there, and it was tough. I had to kind of put my tail between my legs and come on back, and but But I made a pledge, and I didn't tell anybody this pledge, but I said, before I'm done at Columbus, we will be Gables. And that was a personal pledge I made because I wanted the same mystique at Columbus that Gables had. And that was not an easy thing to do.
No, that's for sure. That's for sure. So, Mike, you come back. Who made the decision to move you to linebacker as a junior? Was that Lavelle?
He must have been Coach Lavelle. He had that 4-4 defense that he had brought from Heidelberg, and the two inside linebackers were, pretty pivotal players in his 4-4 defense. And Coach Lavelle was a very emotional coach. He was all business. There was not a lot of putting your arm around you. That was Coach Zorzi.
Yeah.
Coach Lavelle was just kick you in the butt and say, you just need to do this. And it was okay with me. But I learned later on, why, there was a yin and a yang there between Coach Zorzi and Coach Lavelle and Coach Dean. They all coach differently, but they're all just the most tremendous individuals as coaches you could ever want at a high school level. It's just, you don't see that level of commitment.
No.
And I realized how lucky I was when I had them as coaches. But Coach Dean, you'd walk out on the field and he'd just give you that little grin, say a couple words to you, and you just knew he just believed in you. He wasn't even my position coach.
Yeah.
But I never failed to walk out with, he had that clipboard and that whistle, and he just looked, his persona just oozed class. And it was just a feeling I had from him. He didn't have to be my position coach. And then there was Coach Zorzi, who always came in, in his little El Camino, a little bit late, but walking in, and there he was, and he was hugging and putting his hands and smiling, and then just getting in the defensive line's face. And then there was Coach Lavelle, who just expected your utmost, your best performance on every day.
You know what? You just hit on a great point, Mike. What I admired and still admire the most about, and I admire many things about Coach Lavelle, is he demanded the best from his best players. He never coddled his best players. His expectations were, to whom much has been given, much is expected. Dennis always took it a little easier on the guys that were less talented because he knew that they were doing the best they could. But his best players, he pushed and he pushed and he pushed. And, and that's not always the case. Sometimes some coaches coddle their best players. Dennis worked his best players like dogs. And now you understand why he did that.
Yeah, I could never do enough to make him happy, that he could return or let me know.
Yeah.
Maybe he realized how much I did, but at the time, I never knew it.
He wasn't going to tell you that.
No. And as a matter of fact, an interesting story, when my pledge to Columbus came true and we beat Gables 14-7 my senior year, junior year, we lost 7-2 in the Orange Bowl, which I was hoping that we had beaten them twice. But anyway, after that game, he called me and Jeff Sawyer into his office, and he kind of accused us of not playing hard. And Jeff and I walked out of the office we had just beaten Gables. And we're like looking at each other like, what is he saying?
Yeah.
So, now I realize what he was doing, because he's very similar to a coach that I played for with the Giants, and Bill Parcells. He was very much the same way. You couldn't do enough for him. And he would really never pat you on the back, but he kept you around. That's how you knew he was happy with your performance. So, but I loved Coach Lavelle. I still love Coach Lavelle. I'm in contact with him, all the time, and he's the family guy that I wanted to be. The coach, the mentor, the husband, the father, the friend. He had it all, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a husband and a father more than anything, more than playing professional football, because of men like my dad and Coach Lavelle and Coach Zorzi, even Coach Dean when he got married and had his daughters.
How about that?
Run into him at Publix, and just he was so happy.
Yeah,
you never thought that would happen for him. And,
exactly. Mike, let's talk about your senior year at Columbus. Easily one of the very best defenses the school has ever fielded. A tremendous talent. Hands down, you and Jeff Sawyer, the best inside linebacking pair in the history of the school, but a lot of other great players, tremendous players. John Bow, Kerry Nash, Greg Pahulis, Tim Hyman. We can keep going. Mike McCutcheon, Donnie Mills, Mike Silvis. I mean, you guys were the real deal. And there was a very unfortunate incident that occurred that affected both of us. That, yes, you guys had a winning season and you beat Coral Gables, but the circumstances, you guys could have done so much more if it hadn't, the lightning strike that just changed our program.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'll tell you personally, two of the most tragic things that happened to me in my life were when I was at Columbus. And the first was when I was a freshman, spring freshman year. I had a brother that was at Florida State, and he was killed in a car accident going to visit my grandmother in Panama City. So that was, devastating, just devastating to a family. And, coping with that and moving on was difficult for my parents, difficult for all of us. And realized that my older siblings were all out of the house. Yeah. And I was home with my parents. And I had a little brother too that not many people know, but he was 2 years younger than me, and he had severe cerebral palsy. And he never really could walk, talk, or anything. But we gave him he lived with us till the day he died. We took care of him, fed him. But it was a very depressing time. But my little brother Paul lived to be in his 30s, and only because he was very well taken care of. And it was a phenomenal things my parents did for him. We all did. We all chipped in. Senior year, when that lightning struck happened, we were all kind of on the top of the world. We were a team that was, I think, at the time, we were probably undefeated. We were a great team.
You beat Palmetto. That was a huge game.
And you just can't. You find out you don't have control of your life at times, and that was just another typical day at practice, and it was sunshine was out and a little sun shower, and then just in the lightning strike, just the world changed for us, all of us that were there.
Yeah,
and I can remember running to the coaches telling us to go to the shed.
Yeah.
And we all ran, but as we were running, we saw on the JV field, it was the outfield of the baseball field, several players on the ground.
Yeah.
And we realized that, oh my God, that lightning struck in the middle of that practice.
Yeah.
And I till this day remember looking out that shed and watching the coaches aid several players. Every
Yeah.
coach was out there. And I can remember Coach Zorzi and Coach Lewis, I think both of them doing rescue breathing or compressions on a couple players. Some players were staggering to the, as a 16, 17, 15-year-old, this is something that, you never should have to witness, but we all witnessed it. And it was a terrible day in Columbus's history.
Yeah. Mike, you're right. And I don't know if you know this. I was the closest person to Julio Portela. We're in perimeter, and he played corner, and I was at outside linebacker, and they threw an out. We're walking back to the huddle, and boom. It was the loudest, most powerful noise I've ever heard. Threw me like a rag doll. I got up and turned around, and Julio was on his back, literally smoking from the lightning strike. And you're right. Coach Zorzi and Coach Lewis got Julio's heart going again. And that was to their credit. No one knew if there was going to be another bolt or not. And yeah, that shed. And all those years I was at school, Mike, I would sometimes go by that shed and go by the spot in the outfield where that happened. And that stuff doesn't go away. That's for sure. But you guys treated us younger kids, you're great. You were really great. Because the varsity and the JV don't necessarily have a lot in common, but you guys were absolutely supportive, and you dedicated the rest of the season to Julio. And this is where things went wrong football-wise. This wouldn't happen today, obviously, but they made you guys play, what was it, 3 games in 9 or 10 days?
3 games in 9 days.
Yeah, that would not be allowed today. And there's no way you can do that physically. It's impossible.
I think emotionally, it was draining, but emotionally, we had just lost one of our players.
Yeah.
And you don't overcome that in a week. I can remember, when Julio's memorial service was, and I wanted to go. And then I didn't personally know Julio.
Yeah.
But he was a teammate on the JV, and I felt it was an obligation for me to go as one of the team leaders and show my respects. And I can remember going by the funeral home 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, waiting for some of the cars to leave so I could have a moment alone or with very few people there.
Yeah.
And it was midnight. And I said, I got to get home. I got curfew. I can't be out all night. So I went in anyway, and there were hundreds of people there, still there. And I walked, went up, paid my respects, and left. But the scope of the magnitude of that event was it was paralyzing in a lot of respects. And the fact that we went on and played it, those games and those days and that season, it really showed a lot on our part. We could try and deal with that and move on, but it was difficult. Like you said, it's a moment, it's an event that stays in your memory, and you can never get it out of your memory. But it's certainly a learning point. It's given me a lot of respect for human nature, or for nature, for God's nature, and for that things can change in a moment, and you need to really enjoy the moment and take advantage of every minute you have. You just never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and you're right about that, Mike. And so your season you guys ended up 6-4, winning record. You beat Gables, but the woulda, coulda, shoulda, the what ifs, but a tremendous group of guys and some great players. But you were the marquee name, and I'm not blowing smoke at you. You were the marquee name. You were recruited by everybody who was anybody. And I noticed as a younger guy that it didn't get to your head. You weren't a, big man around campus in that regard. As good a linebacker, as I said earlier, like that we've ever had, you had a choice to go basically anywhere you wanted to go. Why Notre Dame, Mike?
Well, I could take this whole podcast, but um, you know, I've been told that you know that the recruiters flocked to Columbus because I was there, and our junior year spring game, there were hundreds and hundreds
Yeah.
of scouts at that spring game,
Yeah.
and the you know the I look at it this way: whether they were there to see me or whoever, they ended up seeing a lot of great players, and
Sure.
a lot of great opportunities came from that. And it really makes me feel good that guys had opportunities because maybe coaches were coming to see me. I don't think Columbus had ever seen anything like that. And
No, that's a fact, Mike.
so there were a lot of scholarship players on that team. And I look back and I look at some of those pictures and I think some of those guys were, to be honest, some of those guys were a little bit overrated and some of them were underrated.
Mm,
And I won't talk about the overrated ones because, but I will say that guys like Brian Regan and Tom Desiato, Mike McCutcheon,
yeah.
those guys were underrated, and they could have played at Division I schools. And Tom Desiato ended up playing at a
Yes.
Division I school.
Yeah, he did.
So, um, so it happens at every level. But I think as you move up to college and pros, the overrated players percentage wise is not as high. But certainly in high school, you can get overrated and underrated pretty easily. But I was, recruited by, a lot of schools, and predominantly I guess it came down to Auburn and Georgia before Notre Dame came into the picture.
Okay.
Notre Dame came into the picture by a totally different means. They weren't recruited. They did not recruit Dade County, period. And they really hadn't, even after I played there, didn't recruit Dade County much at all. But my dad's best friend was the athletic director of Georgia, Joel Eves. So I had a really good connection there. And my dad played college football and basketball at Sewanee. And back when Sewanee was in the Southeastern Conference, so he played against Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. But his basketball coach was Joel Eves, who was the athletic director of Georgia. So I had a good connection there. And then Auburn recruited me very heavily from the sophomore year up. Mike Flynn, who played linebacker there, who was a guy that I looked up to as a Columbus grad. I got to meet him my junior year at an Auburn game against the University of Miami. So I had a connection at Auburn, and the Ortega family there was a brother that was an alumni there, and he was a big booster in Miami. So I had a connection there, but I visited 5 schools. Georgia and Auburn being 2 of the 5. And I narrowed it down to them. And I decided to commit to Auburn. And back then you could commit, and it was only binding within the Southeastern Conference. So I committed to Auburn, and Jeff Sawyer was getting recruited by Auburn too. We had a signing party at my house, and the new head coach was there, Doug Barfield. Tony Segreto from Channel 4 was there interviewing. It was a big deal. It was a big signing by Auburn to get Jeff and I to go.
Yeah.
So I was pretty much done, but I had 1 trip left. You could take 6 trips, and I hadn't taken it. So I had no intention on going anywhere but Auburn at that point in time. one day Dave Riley calls me into his office and says, I want to take you to meet the head coach of Michigan, because they're playing in the Orange Bowl, but they're working out at Mark Light Field at Coral Gables and University of Miami. And I said, okay, so we got in Dave's station wagon. We drove to Mark Light Field, and we walk on the field, and Dave Riley walks right up to Bo Schemblecker and introduces me, and they acted like they were old friends.
Dave knew everybody.
I sat there with my jaw just dropped, and Bo Schemblecker took me aside and offered me a scholarship, offered me a trip. And I said, yeah, that sounds great. I've got a trip left.
Why not?
Take it. So I get back and I get pulled aside by Lou Pagley. And he says, listen, I sent films to Notre Dame of myself, and it was through Mr. Very, the Very family.
Yeah.
I had a contact at Notre Dame, and he sent films to Lou because Lou wanted to go to Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
And the recruiter, Ed Klebick from Notre Dame, sent the letter back. Who I have a copy of that letter now from Lou to Mr. Very, saying, we like Lou. We want to see more film on Lou, but we also want to see film on this 51, Mike Whittington. And so Dave Riley had sent film of me up there. And Lou told me about it. And then I guess a few days later, George Kelly, the linebacker coach, was in Dave Riley's office, called me down, and I had a visit with George Kelly. Now he offered me a scholarship, offered me a trip, but I had one trip left. And I wasn't a close friend of Lou's, but I was a good friend.
Okay.
Teammate. Lou took me aside and said, listen, Mike, you probably aren't going to go to Michigan or Notre Dame, but if you're going to take a trip, go to Notre Dame. Take that trip. So I said, that makes sense. So I took the trip to Notre Dame, and I got up there, and it was something that was the same feeling experience that I had gotten that when I went to Gables, came back to Columbus. Auburn was my Gables, and Notre Dame was my Columbus.
That's perfect.
There were things going on at Auburn that weren't on the up and up. And as a 17-year-old kid, I probably had made some bad choices, which I don't need to go into, but I felt bad about that. And it didn't hit me until I got to Notre Dame.
Okay.
And I came back, and again, I had to go back into my family and tell my dad, listen, I think I made a mistake, and I think I need to go to Notre Dame. And nobody knew about anything that went on with me in Auburn. As a matter of fact, the only person that knew was my sister, and my sister bailed me out. And we made even, so I could walk away with that without feeling bad about it.
Okay.
And Notre Dame was all on the level, up and up. And, it was a spiritual thing, I think. Obviously Notre Dame was a great school, and it was a phenomenal football team. When I went there my freshman year, we were loaded. Now it's competing with kids from all over the country, Texas, California, Ohio, Michigan. But like I said, Notre Dame didn't recruit many kids out of Florida back then. They still really don't recruit a lot of kids out of Florida.
Crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you got to have calculus now to get into Notre Dame.
There's that. Let me ask you, Mike, real quick, because you touched on it. I know what you mean about Columbus. Can you put into words, you may not be able to, the mystique of Notre Dame and what it's like to feel that?
Yeah, it is hard to put into words. When you walk campus and you see just the buildings and the history, it's just a special place, and it's not going to hit everybody equally. But it did me. And, I sacrificed some things to go there. It's hard for a guy from Florida to walk in and fit in. And, they're recruiting the top kids out of Ohio, Michigan, Illinois. And these kids were touted and come in and, to beat out and compete with those guys, you had to show a little more extra. It was difficult, but walking through and just knowing what, like Alex Trujillo said, he used to watch him and his dad used to watch Sunday Notre Dame highlights.
Oh, yeah.
Well, as a kid, we would put on those Notre Dame highlights, and that was the only thing you could watch college-wise on Sunday. And, I can remember when Southern Cal and Notre Dame would play. It was a big deal as a kid watching that. And there was no other school that had the national mystique like Notre Dame did.
Yeah.
But what I realized was, athletics, like at Columbus, there's so much more to that institution than athletics. Athletics is a big thing, but so is their science department, their chemistry department. They're just discovering things that are saving lives. And, athletics is a part that just helps make that school whole. But that would still be a great institution if they didn't have athletics. And so would Columbus.
That's true. I mean, and obviously, Mike, we both know that Columbus has always been known as an athletic school, but our academics have always been strong, and they've never been stronger than they are now. We're proud of that. You said a minute ago you were loaded at Notre Dame, and in 1977, you were part of a national championship team. What were you guys? 11-1, I believe, and you had a guy quarterback named Joe Montana. A lot of other talent, but everybody knows who Joe Montana is. And you look at Joe Montana, he's not a physical specimen. He's an average-looking guy. But Mike, what made Joe Montana a winner? What were the intangibles that Joe Montana had?
Well, I think, like me, he understood what it meant to be at a school like Notre Dame.
Okay.
Even though it didn't go well for him early on in his career, he had plenty of chances to leave. He stuck it out, and to his credit, he stayed and he developed. And you may not think he looks like much of an athlete because when you put him up against a guy like Ben Roethlisberger's this huge, massive physical specimen.
Sure.
The guy was a phenomenal basketball player. And I played many basketball games against him because up there in the winters, you play a lot of basketball. And he was incredibly gifted. He had a sense about him that he could distribute the ball just like he did on the football field. There was no pressure. He loved to be in the moment, and he felt no pressure. Although I wasn't in the huddle with him, I sensed it on the sidelines, and I sensed it in the locker room. The year after we won the national championship, he played in that ice bowl and Cotton Bowl. And it was literally 10, 20 below wind chill, and he was in he was getting into hypothermia at halftime, and he wasn't coming back out. He was in the training room and having chicken soup. And I thought, oh boy, we're in trouble. Well, in the third quarter, he comes running out, and you could just feel his presence, that he was coming out to bring us back and win the game. And that's exactly what he did. But Joe's a great guy. He remembers where he came from, his humble beginnings in a town in Pennsylvania,
Mm.
and he was a great friend back in the day at Notre Dame, and he was a great teammate. He was one of the first guys that I was a freshman. He had this card, and freshmen, you weren't supposed to talk to freshmen. You weren't supposed to give freshmen a time of day. But I remember him pulling over and telling me to hop in, and he drove me to the dining hall. He says, "Don't tell anybody that I did this." I said, I didn't really say anything to him, but I remember that. He stuck his neck out, and
Yeah.
that's the type of guy he was. So I've gotten to visit with him a few times since college and played against him in some NFL games, and just a great guy. It didn't go well for him in the beginning because the Notre Dame team, we were loaded, but we were a team divided because there were half our team were Aero Precision recruits and half were Dan Devine recruits. So
Yeah.
there was a little division there, and he was a Precision recruit. So Devine, he tended to have a tendency to lean towards his recruits.
Sure.
But when Joe got his opportunity, he took full advantage. There's a whole story to that someday it'll be a movie, and it's a great one. It really is. And I was really honored to be part of that.
Mike, there are two other guys that, everybody talks about Rudy and all of that stuff. Two of your good friends, two of your teammates from Columbus, Lou Pagley and Tom Desiato, who you mentioned earlier, ended up at Notre Dame as well. And you talk about perseverance. And I know how proud you are, not only what you did, but especially of what, they did as well. So why don't we do this, Mike? Let's try to remember where we were, because we're going to have to do a part 2 because we've still got a whole lot of ground to cover, So we'll pick up with the story of Lou and Tom at Notre Dame, and then we'll move into the NFL and a very unknown portion of your career, that time in the USFL when you play with a guy named Reggie White. But we'll save that for part 2. And I appreciate this first part, Mike. I think was very enlightening to what Columbus was like back then and how special a place it was for a Gables acolyte to end up playing for Christopher Columbus. And so I've enjoyed part 1, and I can't wait to get into part 2. And before we went on, we were having a great conversation about how the game has changed and the effects of CTE, and we'll save all of that for part 2. So thank you so much, my friend, for part 1. And when there's a part 2, you've got a special guest. So I look forward to it, Mike, and we'll pick up from here. And just so everybody knows, Mike's got his state championship shirt on. I have it on underneath as well, totally unplanned, but it's great to see you in that shirt, and thank you for today, Mike, and I can't wait for part 2.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that this was going to happen. I'm just glad that you feel that this is interesting and warrants a continuation. So hopefully people find my story interesting and inspiring. It's a little different. It's a little unique, and you have a tendency to do that. But I do owe a lot to Columbus. Some things that happened to Columbus that I haven't even mentioned. That brother Kevin helped me out one time. That I probably wouldn't have been there without some of his help. So, I owe a lot to Columbus, and I always will give Columbus a lot of credit for this fantastic life that I've been able to live.
Well, I look forward to part 2, and names like Harry Carson and Lawrence Taylor and Reggie White, and then your post football career, because people forget football players are considered old at 30. Well, you're going to live another 40, 50 years. So there's life after football, which I think will be interesting as well. Anyway, this has been very enjoyable. We'll set up part 2, Explore Nation. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this conversation with the best linebacker in Columbus history. And I look forward to part 2. So on behalf of Explore Nation, thank you, Mike. And until next time, buenos tiempos and adelante.
Thanks, Sean.
Mike.